Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Neil Irwin with Axios. I'm the chief economic correspondent. We're here for a discussion of TCJA frameworks hosted by the Yale Budget Lab. They're, of course, a nonpartisan policy research center that provides in-depth analysis of federal economic policy proposals. This has been a big week for tax policy nerds. Of course, the House, by the skin of its teeth, passed budget reconciliation instructions, I believe it was Tuesday night, that really marked the end of the beginning of this process of figuring out what the future of the U.S. tax code looks like. That's what we're here to discuss today. Of course, the tax cuts from 2017 expire at the end of this year. We'll spend the next hour exploring the impacts of various proposals, how the administration and Congress might consider extending the tax cuts, potentially adding new proposals that we heard from the campaign trail. What are the economics, the politics of various policy options? We'll start with the panel, and if you have questions, you can put them into the chat, and we'll look at your questions in the last 15 minutes of our session. And with that, let's get going. Our panelists: Natasha Sarin, professor of law, Yale Law School, president of the Budget Lab at Yale, former U.S. Treasury official under Biden. Thank you for being here, Natasha. George Callas is executive vice president of public finance at Arnold Ventures. And Brendan Duke is now officially at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Is that correct, Brendan? Formerly CAP. So, Natasha, let's start with you. Help us frame today's discussion. What are some key points about what's ahead, what policymakers should be thinking about, and tell us about the principles that you think should be governing this TCJA extension debate.
Yeah, thanks so much, Neil, for doing this, and to George and Brendan, and I'm excited to talk through all of this with you. I kind of want to start maybe big picture about principles that I hope are going to be governing tax reform in this moment and any sort of discussion of tax policy that all of us are having in the future. And then maybe reflect a bit, though I'm definitely less well-positioned than George and Brendan, to reflect a little bit about some of these precepts in light of the Republican trifecta and what the world's going to look like in reality over the course of the next few months. I wrote a piece with Kim Klossing in 2023 that tried to lay out a bit of a framework for how one should, in the context of some of the challenges that we're experiencing in the United States today, how should we think about this, the looming expiration? At the time it was 2 years off, the looming expiration of big chunks of the TCJA in 2025. And the sort of headline fact that you all know, and we're very grateful, by the way, and I'm excited to see so many friends among the attendees who are listening here, is no matter what happens, tax policy is going to change really dramatically this year. And the question kind of is in what way? And what you're dealing with at the outset is you're dealing with about $4.6 trillion, $5 trillion of expiring tax cuts that are either going to get extended in their totality, or some portion, large portion of them is going to get extended, plus a whole host of other campaign promises that this administration made, which of course I'm sure we'll get to. But as you look at that, you kind of should be looking at it through the lens of our fiscal position and fiscal sustainability in the United States. And the reality is the fiscal situation is a little complex because people who care about debts and deficits have kind of been saying for a while, we can't get to more than 90% debt to GDP. We definitely can't get to more than 100% debt to GDP. And if we do, kind of bad stuff is going to happen. And the challenge is we've blown past some of those markers, and we haven't yet seen the fiscal crisis that we all know is looming. On a current policy baseline, debt to GDP is going to be 119 by the end of the decade. Current law, which is sort of, for all account, really realistically, debt to GDP is going to be 130 plus over the course of the next decade. And so you have to think that eventually you are going to have some sort of need to think about fiscal consolidation in a way that we haven't really grappled with in recent history. And I wonder, and I had hoped that this tax debate would kind of be a moment to be talking seriously about deficit reduction. I don't know, given that the best case scenario of what we experienced this week was a $3 trillion deficit increase. And if that happens, it comes on the heels of like very substantial cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. So like, we'll see. But like, I am not optimistic that that is a precept that is really going to govern in this tax debate, even though I think that it like clearly, obviously should. Even if you're not thinking about fiscal crises, you should be thinking about the fact that the 10-year is flirting with 5%. And boy, does that make an impact on people who are looking to buy houses and buy cars and in businesses that are looking to invest. So like, it feels like where the 10-year is should be relevant to how we think about this tax debate over the course of the next several months. And I hope it is, but I'm a little nervous about the extent to which fiscal concerns are actually going to be meaningfully addressed, or not even redressed, just not made worse, sort of a Hippocratic oath kind of approach. I think another thing, and a place where it's funny, this relative to versions of this that I've done, I am a little bit more pessimistic at this moment than I am for some of this, but like, we are where we are a bit. I am hoping, one of the precepts that Kim and I had in our piece was like, we called it preserving American leadership in an interconnected world. And it sort of sounds different now, sort of 6 weeks into this new administration than it did when we wrote the piece. But the idea was that there are a bunch of areas like in tax where it is relevant to try to think about what the rest of the world is doing as you think about what optimal tax policy is. And certainly that's the case for things like the global minimum tax, where you had like a tax deal that 96% of the world GDP had signed on to, and we kind of didn't implement because we didn't want to go first, but then other countries went, and we were in this position of potentially being in a place where US multinationals were going to pay these taxes no matter what. And the question just was, do we collect any of the revenue? And the same thing with respect to, by the way, like carbon taxation or some sort of corporate carbon fee in the United States, where George and Brendan, again, much better suited to talk about the politics, but they're hard. But that would align us more with what the rest of the world is doing to try to mitigate the sort of climate challenges that the globe faces. And being in a place where we're not doing that actually creates some weird tensions between our trading partners and allies. I'm not sure how to think about some of that in the context of what this administration's foreign policy and approach to the American sort of our stature in the world is likely to be. But I will say that like on some of this stuff, like if a principle that you care about is not preserving American leadership in an interconnected world, but it is simplifying and streamlining the tax code, those are actually kind of related things in that like in international, you have like all of these like overlapping taxes. There's like a BEAT, there's like a FDII, there's like a global minimum tax, there is a corporate alternative minimum tax. And so one thing you can think about is like, is there scope or capacity to try to be a little bit thoughtful about how you design some of these tax approaches that do so in a way that is trying to solve a race to the bottom problem, but also do so in a way that gets rid of some of the inherent complexity in the code. The last thing I'll say is that I do think, I don't know. I hope that we look at tax reform in 2025, and something that Budget Lab is very focused on is trying to do holistic analysis that tells us something about distribution, because it's kind of challenging. Like you're going to see this reconciliation bill. I don't know whether it's one bill or two bills or ultimately what approach that is adopted, but it's going to have like tax provisions where we typically think about distributional tax tables that like JCT and others, many on this call, are sort of thinking very deeply about how to produce. And then we're also potentially going to have spending changes that are important as well, but like aren't necessarily thought of in the same breath or the same distributional table. And a thing that I think we all need to do, like eyes wide open, as we think about where the dollars in this bill are going to go, is think very deeply about like where we know TCJA disproportionately benefits the top. The reality is if you do the version of what the House passed this week, which is like TCJA plus a bunch of cuts on stuff that is disproportionately relevant to people at the bottom, it even becomes an even more concentrated bill at the top of the distribution, which is a choice. It's just a sort of complex choice to think about making in the context of a world that's becoming more unequal and not less. And so I think that highlighting that and sort of thinking very deeply about distribution is something that I think is important. Thinking also deeply, frankly, about efficiency and efficiency gains that can come from tax reform and investment and a pro-growth tax agenda, what that actually means, is something that I think there actually is room for discussion across the aisle in ways that are useful. I wonder if that's going to be what we see in a Republican trifecta, but I do think there is a lot of scope there. So I'll stop because I went on for a bit.
Natasha. George, as Natasha says, a different macroeconomic environment than we had in 2017 on interest rates, the existing debt level, also very narrow majorities in both the House and Senate. How do you see this evolving? You were with Paul Ryan in 2017. How is this a different environment, and how do you see it shaking out?
Yes, so it's it's different in like 50 ways, but I'll hit on maybe two of them that I think are important to discuss. As Natasha said, the macroeconomic and the fiscal environment is very different from 2017. I went back and looked, and when the TCJA was enacted in December of 2017, I think the 10-year was like 2.4%. And last month in January, it hit 4.8 on one day. So it had, now it's come back down a little bit since then, but it's still like in kind of bouncing around in the mid fours. So, roughly 2% higher than when it was enacted. And I think, there are reasons for that, and there are reasons for that matter and are going to be sustained. And, in 2017, we had been experiencing years of quantitative easing by the Fed. Foreign central banks like China had been buying up treasuries because they were for their exchange rate policies. And so there was like unlimited, capital to buy treasuries at low interest rates because central banks were buying them up for reasons that had nothing to do with yield and returns. They had other agendas. That's all unwinding now. Central banks, including the Fed, but also foreign central banks, are buying, not continuing to buy treasuries that way. And so now today's bondholders are people who are looking for yield, and that puts you in a situation where, yes, continuing to borrow, continuing to issue treasuries is going to require the government to compete directly with private, private borrowers and private businesses seeking capital as they compete to offer yields and returns to investors. And that does put you back potentially in that concerning crowd out effect world, if we have deficits that are too high, that didn't really exist when the TCJA was enacted. So I think that has led to much higher deficit concerns, as it should, by the way. I agree with those deficit concerns, in renewing the expiring provisions on the Hill amongst Republicans. They're going to focus. Natasha mentioned distributional issues. They're going to focus less on distributional issues. They're going to focus, but they are focused on the deficit issue and the economic impact of that. Another kind of big difference is that in 2017, tax reform was a project that the key actors had prioritized for years and had been building towards. Paul Ryan, Kevin Brady, and others, Ways and Means back when Dave Camp was chairman, Orrin Hatch, et cetera. Like, these legislators had been working on tax reform for years, and frankly, it won't. We're thinking we might be doing tax reform with President Hillary Clinton. I mean, it had been going on for a long time, and there were reasons for that. The word inversions was becoming a household term because so many U.S. companies were inverting into foreign companies offshore to get out of paying U.S. taxes. People were worried about all this profit shifting going on, and so there was a reason for doing tax reform. Today, it's more like something that's dropped in Congress's lap that they have to deal with because of the expirations. And it's not necessarily the top priority. Leaders and committee chairmen, maybe they want to work on immigration, border security. Maybe they want to work on competing with China. Maybe they want to work on abortion. This wasn't what they would have picked as like their top priority to do if they could do anything, but they have to deal with it. And so, it's something that they're trying to figure out how to deal with something that fell in their lap. And in that regard, I think, you've got sort of these two different camps. You've got one camp that's thinking of this through the lens of a tax reform exercise, which is how we at Arnold Ventures think it should be looked through. It's another opportunity to broaden the base, lower the rates, get rid of special loopholes and subsidies in the tax code, and use it for pro-growth policy, for policy that simplifies the tax code. That's tax reform, and many members are looking at it that way. But other members are kind of looking at this as a tax extenders exercise, where, a bunch of tax provisions are expiring. We need to either make them permanent or change the dates so they don't expire for several more years. That's a very different exercise than tax reform and the trade-offs that involved. And I think that's leading to a lot of people, frankly, kind of talking past each other because they're seeing this as a different kind of project. And so it just makes getting on the same page even harder for Congress.
Great. So Brendan, let's build on that. How do you think about, first of all, what the baseline for policy ought to be in this world where all these provisions are expiring, and how do you think they should be thinking about their options for what's ahead, given the differences from 2017?
Yeah, so I think another aspect that's different from 2017 is just this. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was not the first fiscal policy thing that Congress dealt with in 2017. It was the attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And that had, big tax cuts tilted to wealthy people, paid for by cutting Americans' health care. And that ended up not being a political success. And the Senate ended up not having the stomach to do that. And I think that then informed how they paid for what eventually became the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was putting it on the credit card, right? Fast forward now, we're kind of doing both at once, right? So we are doing the, extension of that 2017 tax law, that's this year, while also, talking about cutting Americans' healthcare and cutting their nutrition assistance at the same time to pay for those tax cuts that are, very much tilted to wealthy Americans. So I think that's kind of, we're doing both at once. And, I think we're going to see whether Congress has a stronger stomach for that really harsh trade-off that I just don't think is that politically popular. If they have a stronger stomach for it now than they did 8 years ago. To me, the bright line is just that we should not be, making the lives of low and moderate income Americans worse to finance tax cuts for wealthy people. And again, that's cutting Medicaid, that's cutting SNAP, that's, everything else. If you were having a shared sacrifice discussion, that would maybe, be a different thing. But this is just so stark, right? That we're talking about cutting SNAP and cutting the estate tax at the same time, right? I think another thing is, we were talking about, the changed macro environment we're in, and George was talking about the tax reform part, which I very much agree with. And I think just offsetting $5 trillion worth of tax cuts is just really, really difficult, right? It's just really big. I've been thinking about this for a while. It's just a big amount of money, and not extending all of them, I think, is a way to make it a lot easier. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do that. I think Natasha and Kim, had a smart approach where they just, kept some components, but did not keep the rate cuts, which are the biggest driver of the biggest single line item of the cost of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Kyle Farmerlow and Don Schneider at AEI, they proposed, scaling back some of the tax cuts. I wouldn't agree with everything in there, but again, just shrinking what you're extending makes, the offsetting exercise a lot easier. And, another approach is, Treasury did an analysis at the beginning of this year showing that you can slim down the size of what you're extending to like $1.8 trillion or so if you just aggressively pare back the tax cuts going to people making over $400,000. So I think that's a key part of that, is just not accepting that, as George was saying, that this is just a tax extenders exercise and you're changing dates and just going with that in the baseline, but actually thinking about what you're extending thoughtfully, I think, is a really important part of that. And then you get to but there's still a cost, right? And so then there's that exercise of how you offset that cost. Again, I think asking low and moderate income Americans to pay more for groceries, pay more for health insurance after we just had an election on the cost of living is a really poor exercise. But there are, progressive ways to raise revenue. And, George and Natasha both proposed some smart ones, like, looking at, capital gains tax reform, which I think everybody can agree is both the current system is both impossible to justify on distributional and technocratic grounds. So I think, that would be a better conversation to be having, of just, trying to not do $4 to $5 trillion. It's just really hard to wrap your head around. And then on top of that, using smart progressive revenue to make our tax code better, rather than asking low and moderate income Americans to just shoulder the burden of extending the estate tax cut and the tax cut for pass-through businesses.
So George, let's build on that a little bit. So one of the big differences we're keying on to from 2017 is that this it looks like especially if the House reconciliation approach is followed, will include big cuts to Medicaid, to SNAP, to some other things. How does that change the politics if you're a Republican, 3-seat majority in the House, depending on where exactly the numbers settle? Add to that, people aren't getting tax cuts; they're getting a continuation of existing income tax rates for the most part, most likely. So the fact that this is not delivering a tax cut, but just preventing a tax increase, and it's coupled with spending cuts potentially, how does that change the politics and the economics for Republicans trying to decide how this takes shape?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky, right? So I'll start with the spending. We're all hearing the same thing. There's obviously a group of, we will probably sort of overgeneralize and refer to them as quote unquote moderates in the House Republican Conference, which, they're probably more diverse, of course, but they have a lot of heartburn about some of the spending cuts that Brendan is talking about that directly reduce benefits to low income families who are their constituents. And you also are going to have a lot of that heartburn among Senate Republicans as well. That's a part of why, like Arnold Ventures, we put out this top 20 offsets report, top 20 wasteful spending, top 20 tax loop, top 10 wasteful spending, top 10 tax loopholes. But there's trillions of dollars there, and on the spending side, it's not. Our focus has not been on, and we're trying to show members of Congress this, just cutting benefits for low income families. But there's so much waste, fraud, and abuse and improper payments that you can get a lot of savings for that. I mean, one of our proposals has to do with Medicare providers engaging in upcoding, and I'm the tax guy, so I'm not a health expert, but providers basically sort of over-diagnosing their patients and adding diagnostic codes so they can get higher reimbursements for things that maybe aren't really health problems for those patients. And that's sort of one example. There's some stuff in the student loan space that we propose as well, where and it's kind of a parallel on the tax offset side. Another one of our arguments is like, look, you guys want to, in Congress, you want to cut spending. Congress has become very clever over the last several decades in disguising what are really spending programs as tax breaks. And just because under sort of CBO definitions, they reduce people's tax liability, doesn't mean they're not really spending programs. And so you ought to be looking at those too. EV credits is kind of like an obvious one that most Republicans in Congress kind of get intuitively, like, oh yeah, that's a tax credit, but that's really more of a subsidy. One thing we're trying to do is say yes, but there's a lot of other things in the tax code that also meet that standard. And again, just because you're getting a higher refund check from the IRS instead of a check from the Department of Energy or the Department or Health and Human Services or HUD or whoever, doesn't mean it ceases to be spending and sort of magically becomes pro-growth tax relief or whatever. It's still spending. And so if you have this heartburn about some of these options because of the impact on low income people, there's a lot of other places to look, and you can still be fiscally responsible and do this.
Natasha, and by the way, be sure to put your questions into the Q&A in the chat that we'll come to in about 20 minutes. Natasha, how true is it that there's room to do some fiscal tightening on the spending side that maybe isn't as painful, that isn't something that really affects people day to day, that is waste, fraud? Is there room to work there in your view?
So I want to be clear that the goals of combating, we've been talking a lot the last 5-6 weeks about waste, fraud, and abuse and fraudulent payments. And I think those are like super worthy goals to be focused on. There's a lot that can be done. George gave us some examples about, I'm sure we would have debates about the particulars, but the idea that there is like good to be done in this space is like obviously true. The challenge, as you just pointed out in your question, Neil, is like, how much can you get from doing versions of that relative to a $4.6 trillion set of tax extensions? You kind of can't get far enough. And like, I was struck by and all of this is, you guys know Washington, Brendan and George much better than I do, but like, I was struck this week that you had Republicans coming out saying like, oh, the word Medicaid isn't in anything in the budget resolution. And it was just like, I mean, like, sure, but there's like really no way to operationalize the instruction without doing Medicaid cuts. And like, I think the thing that's gonna be hard, and I actually wonder what everyone thinks like Democrats' posture should be over the course of the next few months, but like, it's going to be hard to figure out like how they square this circle of wanting to avoid stuff that is painful to real people while still being able to say we're doing some spending cuts that give us space to do the tax extenders is a super hard challenge. And that's why you're seeing them already start to do versions of the gimmicks of like, let's just pretend that the baseline is current policy, because that's a much easier exercise than actually having to have a debate about like, okay, there's real money here or there isn't. And so we're going to pare back the tax extensions and we're just not going to do all of them.
So we just have been talking about the vegetables, spending cuts. Let's talk about the candy that the president likes to talk about, of things that might end up in this bill. Brendan, of the various things that have been out there, no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime pay, no taxes on Social Security, raising the SALT cap or eliminating it, deductibility of auto loan interest. Anything in there that you think of as actually good policy, or do you dislike it all? And anything that you think that you have confidence might it actually end up in this legislation as opposed to something that ends up on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was pretty incredible that Trump, was on a run last summer of proposing ideas that, yeah, I'm not going to speak for Natasha and George, but for a lot of tax experts, gave a lot of heartburn on no tax on X, right? So I think, first of all, I mean, just in that context, they have a very, tight, fiscal, envelope with which to do this. We don't quite know current law, current policy, House, Senate. We don't know what it is, but it's a lot of tax cut they're trying to stuff in before doing all of this stuff. And then on top of that, that obviously adds in cost. And, again, does that mean that we're just doing more cuts to Medicaid, to SNAP in order to finance those things? And then when you look, under the hood, they're either, not that important to most Americans, or actually make a really regressive bill even more regressive. So on that side, the SALT cap, just extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act while, lifting the SALT cap or making moving from $10,000 to $50,000 or what have you, that makes a very regressive bill just much more regressive. It'll just show up in there. It just makes, it makes the tax cuts for, hedge fund managers in New York who didn't really get in on the action as much last time, just a lot bigger. Then, I think no tax on tips is like a good example of, it's a flashy thing. I think it sounds really populist, but at the end of the day, it's kind of a distraction. It's only like 4% of the cost of the whole bill, just because, at least right now, not many Americans, are paid in tips. I mean, we will see if, after this happens, Axios moves to a tipping model. But, I think that's, it's just kind of a distraction from it. And again, is not very good tax policy because of that avoidance part. And then, no tax on Social Security, I think, is like actually kind of the primary example of this, where it's really expensive. It's like over $1 trillion over 10 years. It goes directly, it takes money directly out of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. So essentially defunds the two most popular programs that the American government does, moves up the date at which they, become insolvent, makes the cuts that happen on that insolvency deeper, And then worst of all, doesn't give benefit, about like the lower half of Social Security beneficiaries at all. And so, it's just, I think, a good example of sounding very populist, but again, it is expensive and is really, again, regressive tax policy. So I think a lot of things that, sound really good. I think a lot of tax experts have our work cut out for us in terms of, explaining that, money is not free and that this is taking us away from that efficient pro-growth tax code that both George and Natasha were talking about.
So George, I'm guessing you talk to more Republican members of Congress than Brendan or Natasha. Can you talk about this tension between kind of pro-growth supply side tax policy and some of this kind of more populist stuff? How is that tension playing out within the Republican conference, and how do you see it being resolved as things move toward legislation?
Yeah, Neil, that's actually a really important tension that I was thinking about when Natasha was talking about kind of distribution and also pro-growth tax policy. It is an inconvenient truth that, according to the economic models and the budget models, the tax policies that are the most pro-growth, that do provide the biggest benefit to GDP, also tend to distribute under sort of static distributional tables the highest benefits to upper income people. And that's largely because, business and investment decisions are viewed as the most sensitive to tax treatment, and you can very easily reduce investment, entrepreneurship, innovation, et cetera, with higher taxes, or increase it with lower taxes in a way that, someone with a 40-hour a week, $75,000 a year salary job, where their employer expects them to work 40 hours a week, is not going to work 41 or 39 because tax rates change. And so it is a real tension, I think, especially because Congress is struggling to make the numbers add up, and they want to believe that these policies, because many of them are pro-growth, will lead to a bigger economy, which will bring in more tax revenue. This is the dynamic scoring concept, and that will reduce the cost of extending the tax cuts before you have to even make any hard choices. The problem is, number one, most of the corporate and international provisions, which had the biggest bang for the buck, were made permanent in 2017. They're not on the table right now. The individual provisions, there are very strong arguments for a generous child credit. There are very strong arguments for a larger standard deduction, especially because it simplifies tax filing so much. They don't really do much for economic growth the way, the corporate tax rate or the depreciation rules or the R&D rules do. And so, and the same is true of President Trump's campaign proposals. Those are all targeted at specific constituencies and in specific states that he was campaigning in at the time, and are really, if anything, from an economic efficiency standpoint, represent distortions to, the efficient allocation of resources, represent opportunities to pour resources into tax planning and gaming the system rather than productive investments. And so, yes, that is a huge tension, and the fact that those things are priorities to fit into this box has the potential to, the more of those you do, the more you're going to mute any economic benefits of the tax package, and the more you're going to need honest savings and tax offsets to minimize the deficit impact.
So Natasha, this may be a little in the weeds, but you were at Treasury working on tax policy. How much on some of these, the tipped income thing, the overtime, can rules be designed to keep those from being exploited, to try and keep those as narrow as possible? How much would, if you were still in your Treasury hat, would you see that as something that can be made kind of reasonable policy and not just totally something that gets exploited?
So I think it's actually a fun question in some sense, though not a fun answer, I suspect, because it reflects on something that I think Brendan and George will agree with me, that Congress and politicians in general tend to do too little of when they write tax laws or think about tax policy proposals, which is like actually then trying to like take the next step to like, how do you implement this in any way that they kind of like, there are like sentences in the legislation, like the secretary shall get regulations that do X, and like what the form the regulations take and how that works is kind of left to Treasury and the IRS to work through. And I didn't have this experience with tips, obviously, or overtime because those weren't live proposals, but I had it with many other legislative proposals and some that ultimately were legislated, where the opportunities for gamesmanship are so clear ex ante. And it's true, you can try to like, we did versions of even internally at Budget Lab on the outside as we were trying to think about how to estimate the revenue consequences of some of this. You could say like, if you're in certain NATE categories, then you like could potentially be a tipped worker, but like it's a harder project than you have in your mind to actually design structures such that none of this is going to be exploited or manipulated. And in some sense, why the revenue effects of many of these estimates are going to tend to be higher than you might have guessed is precisely because there is some gamesmanship that's built into the estimates, because there's an understanding that people are in fact going to find ways to classify their income or classify their work in some of these categories. And, want to look at a very clear example of that. 199 Cap A, sort of the last go around for TCJA, provided a lot of those gamesmanship opportunities. And we now have many years of empirical data that suggests that in fact, people are taking advantage of them.
So, George, one of the big questions right now is, the Senate, Mike Crapo, really want to do permanent extensions of the income tax brackets. Explain the trade-offs there and how that applies between the Senate and the House, and what do you see as the desirability or non? How important is that in your view?
So, I think good tax policy should be permanent. But it should also be done in a fiscally responsible way, especially in the current fiscal environment that we were talking about earlier. And I always remind people that the Budget Act does not prohibit permanent tax cuts. It just prohibits permanent unpaid for tax cuts. You have to offset the costs outside the budget window. And that's just a matter of Congress having the courage to make trade-offs. You could, yes, as Brendan mentioned, you could let some of them expire if you deem some of them are not as particularly important. You could let some of them expire. You could pay for others, do some combination of them. You could just kill some off. You could extend some for several years and then let them expire. You could make others permanent and then pay for those outside the budget window. I would like to pay for them inside the budget window as well. But there's different ways you can structure it. It's not just a prohibition on permanent policy. It is a prohibition on doing permanent policy without having to make choices. And I think at the end of the day, that's what some folks are trying to do here. They're trying to avoid admitting that there are trade-offs by changing the rules. And I've been saying it's not just that they're proposing a current policy baseline. They're proposing a current law baseline on the front end so that you can get credit for the fact that it's expiring and you don't have to take into account the full costs and make it look like it costs less on the front end, and then current policy on the back end so you can pretend it doesn't cost anything to extend them. And that, no tax cut and no spending program have ever been treated like that, ever, for good reason, because it's clearly sort of, cherry picking your baseline on different dates, always to yield the most favorable looking score. But the reality is that if you enact a permanent tax bill that increases or that cuts taxes by $4.5 trillion in excess of the revenue raisers in the bill, Treasury is not going to issue zero additional debt as a result of that. Treasury is going to issue $4.5 trillion of additional debt over 10 years, more after 10 years, as a result of that. And that's just a reality that you cannot make go away by simply changing the way you measure it in Congress, because you don't want to, you kind of want to close your eyes and not see it. So, I think a current law baseline that assumes that the laws expire is really important to continue to use. Frankly, I am hopeful the Senate parliamentarian will see it that way, and hopeful that if the Senate parliamentarian sees it that way, that the Senate will not use the nuclear option, because I think there's a short-sightedness there. That those who want to use a current policy baseline right now are handing Brendan and Natasha and their Democratic allies the means to use it in the future for not only tax cuts, but for spending as well. They couldn't make all the temporary spending in the American Rescue Plan in 2021 permanent for free as part of Build Back Better. They would have had to absorb trillions of dollars of costs. This would let them avoid that. This would let progressives do Medicare for all for 1 year, say that it only has a cost for 1 year, and then come back a year later and make it permanent for free. So as excited as Natasha is about that, I think Republicans are not really thinking about this. And I also think that if they use the nuclear option to do it, you can also say bye-bye to the filibuster they've been defending as existential to the Senate for so many years. They will have inadvertently set the stage for just killing off 60 vote thresholds for anything in the Senate.
Once again, put your questions in the Q&A in the chat, and we'll get to those in a very short moment. But first, I want to ask Brendan. So the Democrats got swept out of power, do not control any of the levers in the Congress or the White House. So what should Democrats be doing right now, in your view?
I think they should be making very clear the trade-offs here. Just that this is a really bad approach to fiscal policy, right? They did that in 2017 with both the attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act and the 2017 tax law, and just laying out those stakes that they think that this is a really, really bad idea. And I think there's nothing that is going to, unify, people from the progressive wing to the center left more than a deficit finance tax cut that also manages to cut Americans' health insurance and make them pay more for groceries. So I think that is just the easy thing, and I think that's where we're likely to head. And, just to say, I think I basically agreed with everything George said about the current policy part. I just think that would, especially we're likely talking about some procedural extremism here with what they would have to do with the parliamentarian. That is just going to, inflame Democrats there. And, I will say, I consider myself on the more, fiscally responsible side among progressives, and it's just very hard for me. My ability to talk anybody out of doing a $10,000 per child fully refundable CTC for 3 months and extending that permanent that is gone, right? So I think that's just how it is. That I think I worked on a Democratic presidential primary campaign in 2020, and it was frankly the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act led to a lot of Democrats thinking big on fiscal policy because they don't care about the deficit. Why should we? That times a million, right? If we're talking about that sort of procedural extremity. But I think that, what we're talking about, I can't think of anything that would, unify everybody from the political center to very progressive members of Congress more than a giant tax cut for rich people paid for by making low and moderate income Americans pay more for healthcare and groceries.
So
And
Natasha,
Neil, can I say one thing about this piece with that George and Brendan both just did, which is I think it's interesting because Trump himself, and by virtue of that, the Trump administration, I suspect, though you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, is not gonna care about any of these norms, right? So he's not gonna care that it's gonna make it easier for Democrats to do Medicare for all. He's not gonna care that it's basically eliminating the filibuster. He's not gonna, it's just So I really do think that the nature of how, and I know it's, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about some of the baseline gimmickry, but like this all hinges on congressional Republicans kind of avoid like pushing against the trend, the desire to get as much done as you can, and as much done as you can means current policy baseline. And I would be curious to hear George reflect a little bit more on like what he thinks that how he can handicap that, like just given what we've seen so far in this administration with some of these nominees and how they've gone through kind of relatively easily, even in cases that I thought would be hard. And I don't know if that's if this feels different to you, or if but I am struck by, like, I think a lot of this hangs on whether we avoid nuclear option, and avoiding nuclear option seems to be in the hands of Republicans who are going to get to make and the Senate parliamentarian, but like ultimately Republicans who are going to get to make a choice on whether they care about preserving some of these norms that the president obviously doesn't.
Right. And I see Suzanne's also put a question in the chat about current policy baseline in the Senate. So, you know, to clarify, right, the baseline rules kind of go back at least to the Graham-Rudman law from the 1980s, and that's where the current law, the definition of a current law baseline is actually created, those statutory rules. And we're talking about whether the Senate and those rules assume the spending rules are really complicated, but you know, generally for tax, that means current law is assumed. So if a tax provision expires, it is assumed to expire. It is not assumed to continue on forever. Spending rules are different, and there are some old spending programs that are assumed to continue on forever. Although in 1997 the rules were changed, and as we've seen with like the American Rescue Plan, for example, or the CARES Act, or ARA going back to 2009, the vast majority of spending programs today are treated similarly to tax, where they are assumed to expire if they're temporary, and extending them costs money. You couldn't have made permanent pandemic unemployment benefits at zero cost. It would have cost hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. So that's kind of to dispel this myth, because there's a kind of this myth going around that is creating momentum for a current policy baseline amongst Republicans, that spending is assumed to go on forever and it's free to extend it, whereas taxes are not. And so there's this huge asymmetry. And I say, look at ARP, look at CARES, look at ARA. That's when there's been temporary spending, and that's just not true. It's true for some old programs, but those are sort of grandfathered in for the most part. So, you know, so anyway, I wanted to talk about that because I think that misunderstanding is driving a lot of the momentum for a current policy baseline, this misunderstanding that is spread, that spending is treated completely differently from taxes. You know, I think I honestly, there are clearly Senate Republicans who have heartburn about this. There are also a lot of House Republicans who have heartburn about this. And they get it, right? They get it. And there was this lot of stories about, oh, everything's changed now last night and today because Speaker Johnson came out and said he was okay with a current policy baseline. So all of a sudden there's all this momentum for a current policy baseline. Nothing's changed, right? Speaker Johnson has never been against a current policy baseline. He just happened to say it publicly because he, you know, had a meeting with the Treasury Secretary recently and the president recently. The fact that a current policy baseline was not in the House budget resolution is not because the Speaker was opposed to it. It's because they didn't have the votes. There are enough members who are opposed to it that they don't have the votes to do. If they had the votes to do it in the House, the Speaker wasn't going to hold that up in the House budget resolution. You know, the Senate hasn't really been tested yet as to whether they have the votes, right? So it might not even get to the parliamentarian if they don't have the votes. But there are clearly senators. I mean, Senator Cassidy, you know, filed an amendment on the budget resolution to strike any references to current policy. Now, this was on the Senate's small budget resolution, so it didn't didn't have this really significant consequences, but it was kind of a symbolic statement of principle to file that amendment to make the point. So, I think unfortunately the vast majority probably are willing to go with short-term expedience over the longer-term risks of making a change. But as we know from when the Senate Democrats talked about getting rid of the filibuster, you can have a vast majority, and that's not enough. You need, with thin margins, near unanimity to make a change. And so it's going to come down to, are there enough in the House and the Senate who are willing to fall on their sword that this is just too much of a gimmick that opens a Pandora's box that we don't want to open. I think in the first vote in the House, that block existed, and it's just a question of whether it continues to stand strong.
George, we started this discussion talking about the macro backdrop. We focused on interest rates. There's also inflation that's been kind of elevated and has shown some signs of resurging. How much should inflation risk hang over Republicans' approach to TCJA?
I think it should hang over their approach like a sword of Damocles. I mean, they just saw what happened, right? I mean, not only did they see, they weren't passive in this. They were banging the drums on inflation, and they saw how badly it hurt President Biden's poll numbers and Democrats' prospects in the election. Inflation was arguably the #1 issue, even after it had come down somewhat, still elevated, and still a risk of it going back up. High inflation turned Build Back Better into the IRA, right? I mean, it's completely changed everything there. And high inflation, again, what was high prices were the #1 issue in the election. One would hope that Republicans would not have such short memories, that they've already forgotten that, and that they continue to understand the risk, a risk that they themselves have been explaining for the last few years, that significant deficits drive inflation. And at the end of the day, what 2024 showed us is voters care more about inflation than about the specific goodies you're giving them that cause the inflation. And they will punish you for high inflation rather than reward you for the goodies they got as the inflationary goodies they got in effect. And I think that lesson is forgotten at their own peril.
To put it a little differently, literally no one remembered the $1,300 check they got in March of 2021 when they went to the polls in 2024.
Exactly. Or the expanded child credit, probably. I mean, that's probably exactly right.
Brendan, let me throw this to you. I'm going to kind of paraphrase a long question. Elon Musk has tweeted, and Scott Bessent has talked about getting the deficit down to 3% of GDP. If you believe Elon, very rapidly and within the space of the next year. Can you talk about what that would mean for the economy, for GDP, if there was that rapid a contraction, that rapid a fiscal consolidation to occur?
Yeah. So, my colleague, when I was at CAP, Bobby Kogan and I, we did a piece on the 333 idea. And just to say, like, what kind of fiscal consolidation we're talking about there, if you extend the Trump tax cuts, which is he's talking about a 3% deficit, inclusive of interest, in 2028. Basically, he talked about flatlining non-defense discretionary spending. He talked about, repealing the IRA credit. So you take that into account. Still does not get you anywhere there. You assume 3% growth. You are still not there. You basically have to do a 20% across the board tariff to do that, which I think is a bad idea. And then on top of that, cut SNAP and Medicaid and other programs by 30%. So that's basically the kind of fiscal consolidation we're talking about. So even, before I get into the macro stuff, like that is a lot of suffering that Americans would go through in terms of higher prices for groceries, both because of the tariff and because you've cut SNAP by 30%, and more for health insurance, et cetera. So I think it shows that when cutting the deficit, there are smart ways to do it, but when you've kind of blocked off the smarter ways to do it, that is a pretty bad place. Now, obviously, I think this is not 2010. where, fiscal consolidation right now, the Fed can offset it, and, there's some benefits to that. But, I think fundamentally at the end of the day, the reason why we care about deficits is because they hurt people. People have to pay more on interest rates, et cetera. But if you're also doing deficit reduction that hurts most Americans through those cuts to programs, what are you really doing there? So I think you have to weigh those two things against each other. But, the 3% deficit target he's talking about, if it's combined with what they're with, the rest of the agenda, you can't just use, funny math to get there. Growth helps somewhat with deficits, but it just doesn't help that much. And again, finally, I'll just say, when you think about the rest of the administration's policies on immigration and on trade, it's very possible that whatever small benefit you're getting from the tax cuts, and CBO said in the long run they would reduce growth, is going to be offset by those anti-growth policies from inflation and from trade and immigration.
Great. So we have exactly 2 minutes left and 3 panelists. So let's do the very succinct wrap up. All right, we do this again in 10 months. It's the end of the year. What has passed? What kind of tax policy is prevailing in 2026 going forward in the United States? Natasha, we'll start with you.
I hate having to guess. So I'll say, I think some version of basically full extension, and I think maybe you play around with the time horizons. I hope they don't go nuclear. But I think my hope, my dream is that we talk seriously, and I'll plug that. And I know, Neil, you're going to plug Budget Lab is going to be hosting another one of these and several of these over the course of the next few months, that we talk seriously about what pay for should be on the table and how to do this in a more fiscally responsible way.
Brendan?
End result is what Natasha said, I think, which is extension largely on the credit card for a couple years. I think that comes after a big campaign similar to what we saw when they tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I think that it's going to be a lot of work, but I think just laying out the stakes is going to give a lot of these guys heartburn on it. But I think we have to lay out those stakes in order to get there.
George with the last word.
So 10 months from today is December 27th, which is right about where I put the over-under for whether a tax bill will have been enacted or not. I've heard some people say
horizon very carefully.
Some people say January 1st is a good over-under. It might go into a little bit into 2026, which wouldn't shock me. It's sort of horrifying, but not shocking. I think my hope is that that the House budget resolution is the floor for how much I guess I should say the ceiling for the deficit increase, and that at a minimum that the House deficit hawks in the House can hold the line on that, but also maybe do a little better. That's being agnostic about exactly how you get there. I mean, I'm not endorsing specific spending cuts or anything like that. As I've said, we've offered lots of alternatives. But my hope is that will be, that deficit increase is the worst case scenario, and Congress is able to do better.
Great. We will have to wrap it up there. Thank you to Natasha Sarin, Brendan Duke, George Callas. The next topic in Budget Lab's TCJA series will be on pay-fors, as Natasha said. Also, the Budget Lab is hosting a webinar in March on debt and deficits, one in April on the child tax credit. Hope you'll join for both. Thank you all for being here.